Welcome to the National Bed Federation BedBiz Podcast, the third in our series. And with me today, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation, is Judith Turner, who is the Deputy Chief Ombudsman of the Furniture and Home Improvement Ombudsman, which used to be better known in the industry as the Furniture Ombudsman. I hope you don't mind me saying that, Judith, but I'm sure you're trying to re-establish your new name at the moment. But anyway, I'm delighted you could join me today. And we've got lots to talk about in terms of getting to grips with quite a big subject in terms of dealing with consumer after sales concerns and complaints. So perhaps we could start with you briefly telling me a little bit about the Furniture and Home Improvement Ombudsman and what it offers for businesses.
Of course, thank you for having me today, Jessica. So the Furniture and Home Improvement Ombudsman, as you quite rightly say, was formerly the Furniture Ombudsman. We rebranded last year, and actually before then was also known as Qualitas, because we've been around in the industry for quite some time, established by the Office of Fair Trading in 1992. And the Ombudsman is essentially an alternative dispute resolution scheme. You might hear me refer to that as ADR as we go through, and it provides dispute resolution in the retail, furniture and home improvement sectors. So consumers can bring their unresolved disputes against retailers to us, and we'll independently look at the case and provide an outcome or a resolution to that claim. In addition, though, for retailers, we offer training and advice. It's a voluntary scheme so that retailers who want to join us are able to do so, and we work to protect consumer rights, promote fair trade and raise standards within the industry.
Yeah, you've reminded me that I was involved in the setting up of Qualitas all those years ago, which dates me in the industry dreadfully, doesn't it? So, yeah, I mean, obviously, our members at the Bed Federation are manufacturers. So I'm interested to know a little bit about how, and I know that manufacturers can join the Ombudsman as well as retailers, but I just wonder how that works. Is there a kind of difference in the how a retailer and a manufacturer might use your services?
There can be. It depends whether a manufacturer sells direct to consumers to some extent, or whether there's a guarantee, because if there is a direct relationship with the consumer, they might end up in dispute with the consumer just in the same way that a retailer further down the supply chain may do. So we do occasionally have consumer disputes where there is that direct contractual relationship. Aside from that, though, manufacturers are also able to access our training, our advice line, so they're able to get advice from us and to seek clarification about things like guarantees and any queries that they might have. So they potentially can use the service differently, but if they sell direct, then the ADR dispute resolution service is available to them as well.
So quite often we get scenarios where a retailer kind of almost passes the buck down to the manufacturer, and and we obviously get quite a lot of consumer calls where the consumers sort of identified a manufacturer who might be a member of ours. And we often remind them that the contract is with the retailer, but again, how should a manufacturer handle that kind of a situation?
So in those circumstances where the consumer has a contract with the retailer, the contract sits there and the retailer is obliged to deal with the consumer's complaints or issues under the Consumer Rights Act, for example, or the other consumer regulations that might be applicable. So if the consumer has a right to a remedy against a retailer, it's them that should perform that remedy. They might seek clarification from manufacturers about issues, for example, as to whether something's performing as it should, wearing as it should. So they might seek help and guidance from manufacturers who know the product, but ultimately the right to recourse in those circumstances would sit with the retailer, and they should be the ones that are dealing with it.
So on the training side then for manufacturers, how would that be angled for their benefit? What would be the benefit of a manufacturer taking up your training offer?
I think it's really important that manufacturers understand consumer rights just in the same way that retailers do. I think they need to understand where their obligations are and how they might differ, but also they need to know what their retailers are facing into. And I'll give you a really good example from the Consumer Rights Act, which gives in law one opportunity for a retailer to try to put the product right or to do a repair or a replacement before there is a remedy that might be monetary in nature, like a collection and a refund. And if the manufacturer is saying that they'll support the retailer with a known fault by way of repairs or replacements, but the consumer's already had multiple chances, the retailers had multiple chances to try to put that right with the consumer, what the arrangement between the retailer and the manufacturer is might be different to what the consumer's rights actually are. And I think manufacturers need to understand that in order that they understand what questions are coming from the retailer and why they might be asking those questions, why they might be seeking different support from the manufacturers. So I think from that standpoint, it's important that manufacturers know what the consumer's rights are, but also then know about the fact that they are able to say to a consumer, actually, this is not down to us. You need to go back to the retailer, and that's where the liability sits. That's where the opportunity for you to seek recourse would be. Similarly, if they're offering guarantees, they need to know the status of those guarantees.
Mm. That's a very good point, the nitty-gritty untangling of warranties and guarantees and all the rest of it. But I think that's a really interesting point about making sure that whatever contractual arrangement exists with a manufacturer and retailer is in tune with consumer rights is I think a very useful pointer there. I think that's a really good idea. So turning for a moment then to the consumer, and as far as your service is concerned, how would a consumer engage with you? What would their journey be?
Yeah, so a consumer would typically be in dispute with the retailer before they bring the claim to us. And actually the way that the scheme and the regulations that govern it are structured, the consumer has to let the business have the opportunity to try to put it right first. And that's really important because, part of our role as an ombudsman as in dispute resolution is to bring the parties back together to try to either conciliate an outcome or naturally to bring them back together. So having that time to enable them to understand the issue, to get to grips with it, to maybe try to put it right, I think is really, really important. So the consumer will typically engage with the business first. However, they don't have to engage with the business, for an endless amount of time. So they can have 12 weeks if they don't manage to get a satisfactory resolve within that time, or the business actually holds their hands up sooner and says we're not going to be able to do what the consumer wants to satisfy this claim. They can do what's called deadlocking. They send the consumer a deadlock letter, which gives them the opportunity to come to us a little bit earlier, because the idea is that you're always going to try and resolve the issue as early as possible. So the consumer would initiate a claim, and they can do that via several ways. They can either apply via our online portal. We can email them a form out, or they can have one posted out to them. So lots of different ways that they can access our service. They fill in their form, tell us what the issue is, provide their evidence, and then we'll take it from there. Try to conciliate between the parties, but ultimately we may end up looking at the evidence to see where we think a reasonable resolution or what the liability might be.
And is that the journey for a consumer if the retailer is a member of the FHIO?
Yes.
What about if they're not, or if the manufacturer is but not the retailer?
So again, that's slightly more complicated in terms of the scheme. So the membership of the Ombudsman for retailers is voluntary in this sector. In some sectors, membership of an Ombudsman or an ADR scheme is mandatory, but not in the furniture and home improvement industry at present. So retailers will decide whether or not they want to join the scheme and provide that reassurance for their customers. For the consumers who don't shop with a retailer who's a member of the Ombudsman, they can come to us for inspection reports, for example. So we would still potentially be able to assist them with their evidence gathering, but we couldn't look into a dispute. If the manufacturer is a member but the retailer not, it would depend on whether there's any sort of direct link there, for example, under a guarantee. So a consumer has rights under the Consumer Rights Act for 6 years. If you've got a guarantee that goes over and above that, then the consumer might be able to bring that claim for us to look at only in terms of the guarantee. But otherwise, if there is no guarantee or there's no membership, then we can't actually look into a dispute, but we could help facilitate some evidence gathering for them.
Okay, that's useful to know, because we do obviously get quite a lot of people contacting us about these, as I'm sure people listening do as well. So so that's useful to know. So one question I was asked to ask you was, we as the National Bed Federation are a member of the FHIO. Now, my understanding is that obviously enables us to consult you and get some advice from you if we've got any consumers or retailers or manufacturers coming to us with queries. But can our members, as part of our membership, access your advice in any way, or is that pushing it a bit too far?
They wouldn't be able to. They wouldn't be able to do that. They'd have to join on their own, under their own steam to have access to that. And there are good reasons there. Yourself, if you're asking third hand, and we're able to kind of understand the crux of the issue. But one of the reasons as well is that consumers always able to bring that claim to us. We try to give advice to help businesses and consumers resolve their disputes at the earliest possible time, but it's only based on one side of the story, so it does have limitations to it, and ultimately the consumer would be free to bring their claim, and we'd look at both sides of the story. So there are good reasons for that. Yeah.
Oh, well, that sounds reasonable. I also wanted to ask you, you mentioned the fact that the scheme, your ombudsman and this sector is at the moment, it's voluntary. Can you envisage that it might become mandatory across more sectors? Is that the sort of thing the government might be looking at?
Well, I mean, it's always open for debate, and as the government look again at the status of ADR, I think in terms of the furniture and home improvement industry, it is one of those sectors where there is potential for high consumer detriment. These are big ticket items, potentially, that the consumer is purchasing, and it does always feature on that list of items where the consumer could, potentially suffer detriment. They pay typically upfront for goods. Then there's a lead time, quite a lot of the time, where you're waiting for something to potentially be manufactured to meet the order. So it is one of those sectors where I think it's constantly under review, and for good reason.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see what happens there, won't it? But yes, that would be a bit of a game changer in terms of what might happen, because at the moment there's this slightly weird situation where, as I understand it, a retailer has to be able to point a consumer in the direction of a dispute resolution service without actually having to be a member of one themselves.
It can cause confusion to consumers, because you enter into a contract with a retailer. When you enter into a contract, any of us, we don't necessarily look to what happens if something goes wrong with that. I mean, some people do, but it's not, it's not your first and foremost when you're thinking about selecting a new bed, for example. You're thinking about actually upgrading, had a good night's sleep, and all of those things that we look for. So I think looking at, consumers looking at whether there is that option of what happens if things go wrong. Can I have my claim independently looked at? And you're quite right, under the ADR regulations that came in 2015, a business's obligations are to signpost in the event of a dispute to say, well, actually there is an ombudsman in this sector, but we choose not to be members of it.
I wonder how much awareness there actually is of that requirement out there. Yes. So let's talk a bit about the sort of mattress and bed complaints that you might get involved with in your role, both in terms of dispute resolution and also the sort of things that crop up often. So thinking about mattresses and beds then, what would you point to being your top 3 most common complaints that you receive, and what sort of answers do you give to those?
So, I mean, we did actually look at some figures in advance of this as to last year, and actually in 2020, 72% of the cases that we got related to general quality. Now, I would caveat that, as a lawyer, I would, wouldn't I? But that classification comes from the consumer, who denotes what the complaint is about to them. So that might capture other things, for example, settlement and those sorts of issues. But we had sagging and comfort were both in that top 5, but the vast majority relating to general quality. And in terms of outcomes, I think one of the things we have to bear in mind is that comfort, for example, I just mentioned there, is very subjective. We could, all sit on the same chair and describe it in a very different way. So, we have to bear that in mind. The law places an objective standard, but actually everybody's circumstances can be individual to them. So we look at the claims that we get on a case-by-case basis, based on the evidence that we've got from the parties, what the individual circumstances are. So there's no standard response, and we have to look at things on the balance of probabilities, but the evidence that the parties provide can be quite important in those circumstances as well.
Yes, I think even after all these years, settlement and comfort remain issues that we get calls about often, and I'm sure that's the same for retailers and manufacturers generally, even today. And
that can be down to how it's sold.
Yeah, the subjectiveness of it is quite a challenge. Yes, so we get a lot of people ringing up about settlement, and they get kind of quite. They're quite offended sometimes. They've maybe had an inspector out, and they'll come on and they'll say, but they didn't even lie on the bed to test it, or we've got this big dip in the mattress and they used a piece of string to measure it. So you must get similar comments, do you? So
absolutely, and what you have to remember is that there are limits to the tests that you can do. For every consumer who says that the inspector didn't lay on the bed, there is going to be one that doesn't want them to. So from that perspective, and also he might have a different, a different idea about what's comfortable or not anyway. I think also you have to remember that the cases are judged in the civil courts, which is akin to what we do as well, on the balance of probabilities. So you just need evidence that tips the scales on the balance of probabilities, and anything that gets destructive, so there's a fault with it, do I need to slit it open, have a look inside? Actually, that's a no, because you're never going to need to get that kind of level of scientific detail on the cases. So it is on the balance of probabilities. How old is it? Where is it? Have the instructions been followed? How was it sold? All of those things do come into play, but there are limitations to the inspections from that perspective.
Yes, I think that's a good point about how it was sold, because again, I can recall having conversations with consumers where they've sort of told me, but I specifically said I needed it to be very firm, or that I'd got this particular back problem, or whatever it might be, and obviously none of us was there when the sale took place and the conversation took place. So how would an ombudsman deal with that sort of scenario?
Yes, I think again, like you, we weren't there either, and we can't cross-examine like they could in a court to get that information. However, we have seen cases where the consumer has requested a firm or a medium or a soft tension, and a consultant or an inspector has been out and said, actually, it's not as it was described. It's not what I would think for that tension. It's not performing as I would expect. So I think you never make assumptions about things like that. We would look at the evidence and what's on the paperwork as well. So what was originally, what was the description? We've had pictures of how things have been demonstrated and shown in stores. What are the tensions? How is it supposed to be? How is it supposed to perform? What kind of level of springs are there as well? So all of those things we've had evidence, and we would request that from the retailers. What's in the showroom? What information's out there to enable the consumer to make an informed choice? Because ultimately, if the consumer's got everything there to make the right choice for them, the back-end complaints become less of an issue, because they're not needed, because the consumer's got the wherewithal to choose the right product for them.
Yes, I guess we're possibly hampered as a sector because there is no universal firmness standard. Although one of the arguments against that is that what's firm to somebody who weighs 16 stone and is a big hefty chap, and a 8 stone petite lady is going to be very different. So and so it's a difficult one to necessarily kind of come up with a common standard, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think in the absence of a standard, we're back to what's the evidence that relates to that particular case on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah, there's no sort of one size fits all, is there? So just for a moment, talking about the current restrictions around the shops being closed and premises being closed because of the coronavirus. And we've had calls from consumers, for instance, being told by retailers they're not doing any inspections at the moment, or they're simply closed and people are furloughed, so there's nobody around to give them that level of customer service, which might be a bit frustrating if your bed is so uncomfortable you can't sleep on it or something. What would you advise businesses to do, or consumers to do?
So in terms of the inspections, there are other ways of potentially gathering the evidence. We, for example, have a virtual inspection where we might be able to, if the level of video or photographic evidence is sufficiently clear, then we might be able to still make an outcome on the balance of probabilities. We can get somebody to assess that. I think in terms of the current circumstances and lack of available customer service, I do appreciate that that could be frustrating for both parties actually, but especially for the consumer in those circumstances. I think though the law hasn't stopped. So just because we're in this situation where there might potentially be supply chain delays, there might be issues performing remedies like getting replacements, or even in some circumstances we saw in the first lockdown, printing a check if it was closed, that couldn't, a refund couldn't actually take place. However, the enforcement authorities have been fairly clear on this, that whilst we understand the situation everybody's in, the consumer rights are still there, and so the consumer should be, if they're entitled to a refund, should be entitled to that refund being performed. So whether that's a replacement or a collection and refund, those timescales are still in place. So I think for consumers, the advice is to kind of keep all your evidence and just make sure that you're keeping everybody informed. And similarly for businesses as well, some of this does come down to customer service. So making sure if you can't do something at this moment in time, keeping the consumer informed, giving them realistic timescales, giving them updates. A lot of that can be managed through good, clear communication.
Have you had any calls from consumers saying, I just can't get hold of this retailer and I've got a problem?
We did in the first lockdown, where I think the shutdowns were more prevalent. I think it's probably been as businesses have been able to adjust to working from home, as we all have, then we have seen less of that. But I would imagine that it is still an issue because non-essential shops are still closed.
Yes, well, hopefully not for too many more weeks, fingers crossed. But so can you just explain a little bit more about the different levels of inspection services that you offer for consumers? I gather, having had a look at your very helpful website, there's a smart inspection and a virtual inspection and a gold inspection. So when would they be used, and what are the costs involved?
So a virtual inspection, as I just alluded to, that's something that we identified as being a potential fix to assist evidence gathering during the first lockdown, when people weren't going into homes, nor did consumers want inspectors coming into their homes at that time. So if with the quality of photographs and the availability of that kind of smartphone video evidence, can be really, really useful in evaluating a complaint, and can be sufficient actually in a lot of cases. So we could have a report undertaken by one of our consultants at arm's length, with no geographical limitations, and not having to enter the consumer's home. So what those reports will do will give an indication as to whether the consumer has a valid claim, and they could be used as part of our ADR service as well as evidence if that's appropriate. The cost of the virtual inspections is £135. Now, obviously, if a consumer has a claim against a business who's a member, that would kind of be, if we needed one, that would be wrapped up in the ADR, and our ADR service is free to consumers where the businesses are members. But if the consumer wants to gather evidence, then a virtual inspection could be a potential for them. If we needed to send somebody in to have a look at the product, there are a couple of other options there. One is the smart inspection, which is carried out on a consultancy basis, and that report is designed to give the consumer an indication as to the validity of their complaint. So it's not necessarily going to be used in court like the gold inspection report that I'll come on to in a moment, but it at least gives the consumer an indication as to what the issue is, and then they might be able to take that back to the retailer. Again, only available for consumers who don't shop with members who are businesses who are members of ours, but they are used in bed and mattress complaints in order to assess the validity, and they come at a cost of £150. And then alternatively, if a more in-depth report is required, so for example, if the parties are engaged in court action, cases already going to court, then they might think about a gold inspection, and that is a court compliant report that can be used in front of a court. We again might use these if a case proceeded to adjudication within our own ADR service, but that provides an independent assessment of the product and a bit more of an in-depth look at what the issue is, identify the faults, what might be required to rectify the faults, and again can be used in furniture cases to good effect. As you would probably expect, the cost of those reports is subject to an individual quotation. They're a little bit more because they do more in terms of that detail, and they are effectively an expert witness court compliant report. So the reports can be commissioned by consumers, businesses, finance providers, for example. And we use a pool of independent consultants who are up and down the country, selected for their kind of knowledge and expertise and experience in their fields.
Oh, right. So out of interest then, how many bed and mattress complaints might sort of end up going all the way to court? I would imagine it's not that many.
Yeah, we don't get anything other than anecdotal feedback about those, really, in terms of I mean, some might even bypass the scheme altogether, especially if they're not a member. So we don't really have access to that sort of data, unfortunately. It is always interesting though, because our experience of the few that we do get the feedback on is that they if they've been through our process, especially with an adjudication, that tends to be where the courts end up settling as well in terms of outcomes. But again, very, very few and far between that we get that feedback.
Right, yeah, very frustrating sometimes not to know the outcomes, isn't it? So talking of adjudications, are the Ombudsman's adjudications binding on consumers and businesses?
They are. Our decisions are binding on the businesses, because they sign up to the scheme and a code of practice.
Right.
So that's what binds them to the decision. For a consumer, no, the outcomes aren't binding, nor is the process. A consumer's free to withdraw at any time from the process. However, if they accept an outcome as part of our adjudication, or they accept an offer from the retailer as part of our process, then that would be in full and final settlement of everything that formed part of it at that time.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So that's quite useful. So you mentioned that you've got a team of independent inspectors carrying out inspections and things. What? And I said I might ask you this question, Judith. Presumably, you mentioned you have you worked as a lawyer or trained as a lawyer previously. Is that the kind of minimum qualification for your team at the Ombudsman?
Yeah, so for the independent consultants, they're the furniture and home improvement experts, so they would have potentially qualifications, potentially experience. With the Ombudsman team, there is a minimum qualification that our Ombudsmen are qualified to the equivalent of a law degree. So we do have that as a base requirement for our team, because it gives them the skills and the capacity to gather the information, gather the evidence, and to provide really high quality evaluation and decisions.
And I guess you all know the Consumer Rights Act backwards and forwards as well. Are there any plans to amend it or review it or update it? Do you know?
There are some amendments being consulted on actually by the Law Commission at the moment with regards to transfer of ownership in when retailers potentially go into administration. So the Law Commission consulted on that back in October. I think in terms of the EU exit, if that's kind of the broader question, at the moment I don't think there are any plans to overhaul certainly consumer law, but there are some interesting developments I understand that are coming from Europe, and it might be that we look at that, as the government looks at that, to make sure there's not too much divergence, but I'm not too sure where that is on the list of priorities just at the moment.
Yes, I think they're quite busy in government at the moment, but I'd heard about the transfer of ownership. In fact, I think we even submitted a comment on that for that consultation, just a kind of warning shot across the bows about consequences for manufacturers and contracts, in our sector. So it'd be interesting to see what what the feedback is on that one, isn't it? So now final question then, Judith, for you. I've been giving you a bit of a grilling, I know. How can our members or manufacturers out there and bed retailers find out more about joining the FHIO? What sort of cost is involved for a business to join you? And also, I think members and non-members can access your training, can't they, as well? And I think we get a a discount rate for MBF members because of our membership.
That's right, yes. So in terms of membership, there is a lot of information on our website, fhio.org. So if businesses are interested, the membership fee is based on turnover, and there is a calculator that they can go through. They can also request and book in a meeting through the website with our membership director. So again, that's new functionality that we brought in last year. So it's all very, very easy to use. If they want more information, we can have a conversation and a consultation around that. There's also quite a lot of new developments, I think, as lots of businesses have and organisations have undergone over the last 12 months or so. So in terms of what we do and how we deliver it, we now do online webinars, which we have a series of webinars planned in that do a little snapshot as to some of the issues, the current issues, and some of the things that our members face into. So again, lots of information on our social media with regards to that, and it can be quite fast paced and fast moving. So that's a really good place. You sign up to a newsletter as well, so and get those updates direct. And then, yes, in terms of training, again, we've redeveloped our training so that we can offer it online, and we can do that virtually rather than classroom. I think lots of organisations have done similar, and these sorts of platforms are really great, quite intuitive, and you can still deliver the learning that you need to deliver on that. I'm quite excited about some of that. So again, all our courses that we had City and Guilds accredited, we can deliver via the online platforms as well. So yes, again, check out our website, and there'll be dates coming up for those very, very soon.
Oh, that sounds really interesting. And that's the training, as I said, non-members can access as well.
Yes, they can.
Yeah, so that's your website's fhio.org.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that's great. Well, Judith, that's been really interesting. Thank you very much. I've been scribbling away little notes while we've been talking, thinking, oh, I must pick up on that and remind members about this and what have you. So it's been lovely to talk to you, and thank you very much for your time. And I've no doubt we'll be in touch asking you questions about some weird and wonderful complaint or issue that somebody contacts us about in the not too distant future.
No problem at all. Nice to speak to you.
Take care. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you.